They say bear is tastiest in late fall because the animals have been feeding for weeks on acorns, but it was pelts my friends wanted. It was early morning when luck blessed us, a she-bear and her cubs at the edge of a swamp. We cut the canoe in sharply toward shore and muffled our paddles, and not until we beached did the three of them run, the two cubs scrambling to the top of a tree where they commenced to whine like puppies. Mama Bruin doubled back the moment she missed her offspring and faced us. Partly rising on her hind legs, Swanson brought his rifle at his shoulder, and at the flash, she fell where she'd stood. We went over and were looking at her black coat when suddenly, instead of a dead bear, we had a very live one, and the way George and I got out of reach was very rapid but inelegant. Swanny fidgeted too.
Swanny, huh?
Yeah.
I like Swanny?
That name threw me off for a minute.
That's not a real name.
Swanny fidgeted too with his long gun, or so it seemed. Finally, he fired, and she was ours for good. The boys began taking the skin, and then George decided he also wanted a cub, both of whom were still cowering in the treetop. A shot to the head brought one tumbling down. Seeing this gave Rusty bear fever, and he declared he wanted the other cub alive. With some difficulty, they shook him out of the tree. Once the mother bear was skinned, we took the live cub with us, but the little bear would not sit still in the boat, so we let him go. He seemed tame enough then, and I stroked him on the back before he disappeared in the bushes. We floated down to Rainbow Lake, landed, and George soon had a splendid trout dinner cooked. That night, when the fire was fading, old Sturgis stopped by. He must have been about 80, smoked a long churchwarden pipe, and owned property thereabouts, a local character. When we mentioned our encounter with the bear and the cubs, he puffed thoughtfully for a moment and said, "It reminds me of an incident up here long ago." The four of us exchanged glances. We were already in our sleeping bags and bone-tired. No one was in the mood for one of his stories, but then he said, "Had to do with a panther." "A panther?" we exclaimed. "Solitary creatures," he nodded, loading the pipe, "but abundantly sly." I doubt he even noticed our sudden interest, or maybe he took it for granted, for he was already lost in reminiscence. It was late in the fall, about this time of year in 1957. My brother Dick and I had come up with a new rifle he wanted to try. On our third day out, we were just south of the falls when Dickie glassed a monstrous buck on the far side of the lake. When we crossed over, we tracked him 1,000 yards up an old dry wash, and then not only lost him, but ourselves too. That evening, Dick had to go back to town, but I stayed on, determined to meet that deer again. Night fell, and I made camp next to a stream, just a mile or so from where we sit now. I built a fire and slept like the dead, but sometime during the night, long after my fire had gone cold, I awoke to one of the strangest sensations. "What was it?" I asked. Leaves, branches of dry leaves were being heaped upon me. I opened one eye long enough to see the panther slink off. She was trying to hide what she took for choice carrion, me. Well, I resolved not to become anyone's supper and to oppose cunning with cunning. I found a thick bough of fallen tree and dragged it to the fire, put some leaves atop it, then went and hid behind a rock. She appeared before long, followed by 2 hungry cubs. Slowly she crept to within 15 paces of the spot where she had left me covered up with leaves and crouched down with her green eyes glaring at the log. The next instant she made a spring, struck the claws of both her 4 feet into it, and buried her sharp fangs deep in the rotten wood. Boys, the look on her face when she found herself deceived. Well, she stayed for a moment in the same attitude, quite confounded, but I did not leave her time to deliberate. I put a bullet right into her brain, and down she dropped. Jeez, what if you'd missed? Oh, I hate to think. And what happened to the cubs? I never knew. "They're likely all grown up and lurking around here even now," he said for effect, at which we all laughed as we inched our beds a little closer together. When he'd left, I asked Swanson if what the old codger had told us could possibly be true. "No," he yawned. "Go to sleep." Next morning we were all up just before sunrise, dressed, and after some barely warmed-up coffee, walked out to the big meadow where deer were said to browse. We separated. I chose a large black walnut tree to settle under, the field slanting downhill before me and a small creek murmuring behind. Perhaps I dozed. Then, as the sky lightened, there came the sound of animals waking, yard dogs barking, the twinkle of a goat's bell, some lambs mewing. From over the ridge. Out of the woods came a snorting sound, likely an elk or a deer, but I saw no deer. only listened to a woodpecker hammering away down in the valley. I watched mourning doves, a light in a crabapple tree, and a squirrel run along the limb, his cheeks full. Later, I glimpsed a doe and her fawn walking far off through goldenrod. She must have winded me because she moved away with the special nimbleness of her kind, and I saw with admiration how she waited, her large ears now fully rounded, and her manner curious, slightly petulant, for the baby to come up. They seemed very smug for a moment, the two of them, trotting off without a care and leaving me there by myself. Now I looked for my gun and turned to go. It had been a fine morning hunt.
We interrupt this podcast for this brief public service announcement.
We interrupt this program for an important news announcement.
Hello, friends. We're coming at you from the land of the free and the home of the brave. Made in America matters, so we are asking all red-blooded, true blue, red, white, and blue Americans to support one of our favorite U.S. American manufacturing companies, Leupold Optics. Just ask yourself, have you America today? If not, consider purchasing some new state-of-the-art shades from America's Leupold Optics. Support American manufacturing with a new pair of 6 shades from LeupoldShop.com. And right now, when you use the code Brian2020, you get a free shirt of your choice from Leupold. Might I recommend one of my favorite shirts at Leupold? This glorious American Eagle shirt, because freedom. The American spirit shines brightest when our backs are against the wall. Through wars, natural disasters, and economic collapses, we've always shown a sense of grit and ingenuity when it's needed most. It's the same self-reliant spirit Fred Leupold had when he started his Oregon-based company 113 years ago. And it's what keeps the factory performing in Oregon today. Friends, support American manufacturing, because communism sucks. Made in America matters more than ever, so we're asking all red-blooded, true blue, red and white and blue. Red and blue. That's right.
All joking aside, folks, we over here at Gritty love working with Leupold Optics. If you're in the market for a new spotting scope or maybe some binoculars, please consider checking out Leupold Optics. Or, if you're looking for a new pair of sunglasses for the 2020 season, check out LeupoldShop.com and use the code Brian2020. Links are going to be in the description. Thanks, folks. Back to the show.
All right. Welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I am your host, Brian Call, and I am joined by my brother, the Gritty Broman, behind the camera. How are you, Brent?
I'm well, thank you.
What'd you think of that story there?
It's confusing. Things have changed.
Well, this is an excerpt from the book. What you just heard is an excerpt from the book, The Fair Chase, The Epic Story of Hunting in America by Philip Dre. And I got this book as a gift from my friend Mark Erskine, and I really enjoyed the book. I read the book. I think it's a good companion book to the discussions that we're having about Theodore Roosevelt and the conservation ethic and the movement that he really put into place with policy. And this book, it talks about basically the American and the fair chase ethos that we have adopted, the American attitude toward hunting and so on.
That those men clearly did not have.
Well, did they? Did they not? It's kind of interesting. Let me finish. Let me continue.
Well, I feel it goes along with the. Today we have something a little different. We have the charismatic megafauna, which are sacred and should not be touched. But fish still have no souls.
Yes.
Fish have never had a soul as far as humankind has ever treated
the humane movement, as they called it in Theodore Roosevelt's day, is very strong today. The humane movement.
Yes.
Which is this idea that in so many, it's like the animal rights movement. They called it the humane movement. Back in Theodore Roosevelt's day, the humane movement made sense because they were capturing sea turtles and then nailing them to the deck of the boat until they brought them into dock. That way they didn't get away and they could just live for a week or so on the deck, and then they could bring them back and sell them for turtle soup. So there wasn't a lot of humane harvesting at the time. It was more like we need to make a living and survive, and people's attitudes toward wildlife was harsh or could be harsh. Now, the Native American culture was different. They had a lot more compassion for wildlife than the European did. Not to say that there weren't Europeans who did. There were Europeans who were down on the docks, there were Europeans who were, I shouldn't say Europeans anymore. They were colonial Americans who were sitting there saying, okay, we got to stop inhumane treatment of animals. And it wasn't just in the form of wild animals, but it was also the attitude toward horses and cows and livestock. There started to become things that were just completely unacceptable in New York. You couldn't treat your horse a certain way anymore. Mm-hmm. In the past, though, it was you'd see bone-thin horses being worked to death, and that was no longer acceptable. So very interesting. We tend to think that we're different today than we were back when. But the deeper you go back into history, you realize the human animal hasn't really changed much. We're kind of the same, just with more tech. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? The dastardly deeds we do, we still do. Mm-hmm. We just do them probably with less frequency thanks to civilization. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, this book, what I like about it that's interesting is it does dive into, I guess, the evolutionary development of man. And, why is hunting such a big deal to us? And one of my favorite podcasts I've done, and one of the favorite speakers I've listened to on this subject is Shane Mahoney. And he's been on here a couple of times where he talks about the history of man, evolution of man, and how much hunting has made is responsible for the creatures we are today.
Yeah, it plays a large part for sure.
Right, because as he has said, hunting is man's oldest try at life, oldest and most successful try at life. That without hunting, there is no man. There's no man that can throw a football the way he does. Mm-hmm. There's no man that can hit a baseball like that. There's no human being that can aim and shoot like we can today. Like without hunting, those things wouldn't exist. We wouldn't have,
sports
at all. Like they're all kind of a form of hunting that has been, now that we don't need to hunt to live, we still are blown away by the ability of it's two things, to be a warrior or to hunt. Like those are the two things that human beings needed to be able to do to survive. They needed to be able to hunt, to eat, and then they needed to be able to battle to survive against other human beings and other animals. They're large predators like a saber-toothed tiger of some kind. Like, yeah, you need to be able to, find a way to defend yourself, even though you're pretty when you stack human beings up, we traded big brains for claws and teeth and thick hides, and
that was a gamble. It was a serious gamble. It turned out well.
Yeah,
but let's be real, that was
yeah, because there's not a predator pretty much on the planet that wouldn't be able to take us.
I know people that get taken down by like a 15-pound dog, and those aren't even a real predator.
There's no doubt. Like if I did go out and I didn't, and animals hadn't evolved to fear us for our ability to throw a spear or to shoot an arrow, I think that there's an instinct that they have, just like we do, of the danger of each other. You know what I mean? And if there wasn't that barrier, because if a mountain lion had the attitude of not being afraid of a human at all, they'd eat a lot more of us, man. And the same with the bear. Bears would just eat us all the time. We're the easiest thing to eat. We're just a walking we can't run fast. We can't climb fast. We can't.
I feel like mountain lions would get us more. I mean, they could be inside of a city and you wouldn't know.
Oh yeah, there'd be a problem. No doubt.
Coyotes.
We have the weakest armor. Without the brains, we'd be really hosed. Anyway, I'm going to go back to the book because this is the whole point of that introduction story we just read. The author Philip Dray goes on to say this. Listen, Brent. He says, as a boy, I devoured stories like these. Occasionally, beneath the covers of flashlight, enthralled by the hunter's stealthy advance into the non-human world, the sudden stir of leaves, and the well-made shot. All of Minnesota then seemed connected to the sport. Antlered deer and moose stared down from the wood-paneled walls of local restaurants. One could buy a box of shotgun shells at many filling stations, and everywhere, even at the end of city blocks, paths led away to woods or wetlands. From an early age, I heard the implied summons to wilderness in the state's enchanted nickname, the land of sky-blue waters. And it was with a sense of determination akin to pilgrimage that our first family vacation included a stop at the Hotel Duluth, where in 1929 a hungry black bear had smashed violently through a plate glass window and entered the coffee shop, the premises of which now displayed the intruder as a stuffed tourist attraction.
Wow. That was a hungry bear.
So growing up in Minnesota, which is basically southern Canada, he basically sorry, just kidding there. But he's by the Great Lakes. He grew up in this place, and man, when I read that, I felt I was born in 1974, and I can recall having Field and Stream magazines at the house, any magazine, hunting magazine I could get my hands on, because we didn't have the internet, dude. Mm-hmm. We had I remember watching on TV Mutual of Omaha, where it was kind of like our National Geographic back in the day, and you'd have like these animals, you'd watch a cheetah chase a gazelle and or a black bear, hunt. We didn't have a lot to choose from, but what we did have, I would devour. And when you're looking at old hunting magazines and you're reading stories like this one a little bit. There's a little bit of silliness, especially some of the really old magazines that were from the 50s and 60s that I could get my hands on that were floating around. There was a different attitude, and I can remember getting up really early in the morning to go hunting with my uncles or my dad. I remember Dad taking me out to the Oregon coast, and we would walk the train tracks through the coastal forest there and get on elk. And you could hear elk screaming, and they'd cross the tracks. I remember Dad coming to full draw a couple times on that. And I also remember hunting the coast on the weekends for deer. We had we were on this little ledge, this cliff ledge, and I don't remember how old I was. We had a little green tent that they popped up. Dad and Mom popped up. And then I went out with Dad early in the morning, stalking through the woods. And of course, I thought I was quiet, but I probably wasn't. And we snuck up to this little hill, and I had to be, I don't know, 8 years old, 9, something like that. And there was this little ledge, and then down below was ferns and forest, and it was on the steep. Dad and I crept to the edge, and these deer started walking by, and there was a bunch of does and a buck in the back. So Dad had his bow, and he was getting ready to shoot one of those things. And Dad did all those like archery tournaments and stuff, like the stake archery tournaments that they do with the church group. And there was, all sorts of stuff you could win. And, it was like where my neck of the woods, like archery hunting it was all new at the time. I remember he had like some kind of Jennings bow, and later he had like a Martin Wildcat, and he had a Indian.
He still talks about that Indian to this day.
Yeah, the Indian. It's funny, like you couldn't call a bow that today. Yeah, I don't think. The Indian. The Indian. I don't remember what it was called, but it had this wood riser and carbon limbs at the time. And anyway, these bows were back in the day. It was big aluminum arrows, pretty heavy arrows, pretty slow, loud. But I remember sitting there and those deer coming up, and then they started snorting, chasing does, like grunting, and then. Later, I heard them blowing their nose because they had smelled us, and Dad had slipped off while I just watched the whole time, and those deer walked right to me, and I watched them at super close range, and they're looking around, and I thought any minute my dad was going to shoot that buck, and then they walked off, and turns out, that he didn't get in range, he didn't get in position to take a shot. If he'd stayed with me, he'd have shot one, but I look back on all those times, and for me there was a very romantic period, because anytime you got outdoors and you really started to hunt, it was a different kind of feeling, man. It was intense. And looking through all those old magazines, all that kind of stuff, reading what I could read, listening to him talk about this story with the gentleman and the bears. I'd read stories like that all the time in these magazines. And looking back, they're kind of comical the way that they were written, but this is the sort of thing, like he said, as a boy, I devoured stories like these, occasionally beneath the covers by flashlight, enthralled by the hunter's stealthy advance into the non-human world, the sudden stir of leaves, and the well-made shot. And his point of this story is there is a romanticism kind of associated with hunting, and there's an ethic that followed it later on, and a culture in our country related to it. So this book dives into that. I got to admit, when I first read it, I'm like, you're shooting cubs out of trees, you're shooting sows, but you're talking about a time where it was like any predator was on the table. The culture and the attitude toward them was, we need to get rid of them as much as possible because they're
halting westward expansion.
Yeah, they're hurting the other game populations. There wasn't a lot of, we weren't too worried about the predators.
Yeah. living with my in-laws, and I want to move over there. So we're going to clear out everything that lives.
And when he says right here, hey, my friends and they say that bear is the best tasting when they've been eating acorns, blah, 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 in the fall. But he's like, we weren't really there for that. We were there for the hides, the pelts, And then to say shooting cubs, and then the naivety of thinking, oh, we just let a cub go, so it probably is going to grow up fine without its mother. No, it probably got ate by another boar.
Pretty soon thereafter.
It just doesn't have the skills. That's why they're with their mom so long, is because they got to learn. Just like human babies, they got to learn. And bear cubs just happen to need a lot more time with their parents.
And half of their species is willing to eat them
right
at any given moment. So they've got to get somewhat big enough.
They do have a little cannibalism thing going on. Okay, so I'm going to continue with the story with the book. It says, this author says, despite my fascination with brute nature, casting for sunfish in Minneapolis' small city lakes with the Zebco Junior rod and reel was as close to it as I came. Once the beetles entered my life, my interests were permanently redirected. I never did learn to shoot, and soon after college, I moved away from the upper Midwest hunt country. It was after writing several books about prominent social justice issues that I began to wish for a subject that was less overtly political, yet whose trajectory was braided firmly through our country's social, cultural, and political history. Hunting, though it has often been a means of subsistence, is also America's oldest recreation, and thus seemed ripe for the kind of survey I had in mind. Over the past half-century, unfortunately, the subject has become something of a polarizing red state, blue state issue. But my hunch was that beyond the at times vociferous rhetoric surrounding it lay a history that was in fact unifying and widely shared. My own youthful recollection of its allure hinted at such a possibility. This book's objective, then, is to go beyond the present-day cultural battles regarding hunting, and those of gun and animal rights generally, to explore what hunting's history has to tell us about the country's legends, its faith in manifest destiny, its evolving views on nature, wildlife, Native Americans, and the concept of race, its love of sports and leisure, its notions of self-reliance and manhood. In short, about nothing less than the shaping of our national temperament.
That was a big nugget to try and chew there. I had to stop and go look up vociferous.
And share.
Vociferous is an adjective, especially of a person or speech, and what it's in reference to. It means vehemence or clamorous.
Yeah, intense, vociferous.
Which I kind of guessed from the...
in your face.
Yeah, I kind of guessed from context, but...
Yeah, the vociferous discussions.
I feel like all politics are vociferous. Any discussion about politics whatsoever.
Yeah. This book will be interesting because he dives into all these things that sort of tie into, like, how did hunting come to be, and how is, like he says here at the end, in short, about nothing less than the shaping of our national temperament.
It's weird because even if you and I went out hunting, I couldn't just decide to shoot a bear today. Not without going to jail. You know what I mean? Like, there's a system in place.
You wouldn't go to jail. Generally, you don't go to jail for game laws, but you would lose your gun, your weapon. You would lose your right to hunt. Yeah, and you would be fined.
Serious consequences, you know? So the idea that they're like, I guess I will shoot a bear is kind of alien to me. I have a hard time wrapping my mind around that, but I guess he is trying to paint the picture of what they were working against, I suppose.
Well, whether you agree with the story or don't agree with the bear hunting story, you can see the cultural shift that's occurred from that time to now. Because
a big cultural shift.
Yeah, just because of how we look at game management and so on. And the idea of sort of hunting without the concern for the meat and just doing it for a pelt. There has been a cultural shift away from that. Rightly so. There's so much more to hunting than that story portrays. It's sort of focused on the adventure, a little bit of trophy kind of attitude of hunting. The old guy telling stories. It has a nostalgic feel to it, you know. It makes you feel, because we've all been in camp with some dude, some old guy that sits there and tells you about what it was like back in the, 50s or the 40s. My own grandfather has stories of treeing a bear without a gun and then standing there for 30 minutes waiting for his brother to run and get the gun and trying to keep the bear in the tree. But once the bear realized there's only one dude down there, the bear started to come down the tree. And he's like, do I stay here? And he tried to scare it back up the tree, and the bear was like, nah, you're not. You don't scare me.
No.
And it was a big, big black bear in California. And he's like, this ain't going to work. And he started backing up, and his dog was there. And the dog was what helped. They had one dog. Mm-hmm. And the bear shimmies down the tree, and then the dog chases the bear, and it disappears. Something like a week later, the dog rolls up to the house, and it's skin and bones. Skin and bones. They were in the middle of nowhere. The dog just ran there. Well, he's gone. And sure enough, the dog shows back up at the house, and they nurse him back to health. But different times, Mm-hmm. But hunting is part of the American way of life. And it is deeply, even though people's attitudes have changed or shifted, you still, if you ask people, some 75% of Americans believe that hunting is something that we should still be allowed to do. That's powerful, considering something like 7 or 8% are active hunters, or maybe 10. Like, it's really, those numbers are hard to estimate, but it's still a much larger portion of people of Americans believe that hunting should be something you can do, especially for food. That has not shifted, despite the fact that the hunter is the minority. They're rare. I couldn't walk into the office at work doing consulting. I couldn't walk anywhere without running into people left and right who are fascinated by hunting and my stories when they hear about or see a photo of me somewhere, like Alaska, with a black bear. They're just like, cannot compute, you're a real life adventurer. Something I take for granted is normal life. It's part of a way of life I've always had. We went hunting this year with Metabolic Mike, and Mike was with Lampers and I, and we got deep after mule deer, and he'd never hunted or killed, like really hunted and never killed animals and harvested.
He's an outdoorsy guy, but I would still kind of.
A lot of people are outdoorsy and yet have never shot an animal.
But there's a lot. I was going to say there are a lot of people that are outdoorsy, but are still / concrete babies. Like, there's a lot of people that go on hikes all the time, but that hike is within a city.
Right,
it really is. It's maybe there's a small mountain range or a park that people go into, but it's not like, I would not classify anything like wilderness.
It's different. Like our dad, when he was, 12,
13, 11, and 7,
they got dropped off on a ranch for 2 or 3 weeks straight to take care of themselves.
Him, his brother, and his cousin.
To keep
he was the man
to
of
ride
the house
the fence line
at
right.
13.
Man of the house, and it was outdoors. It was just a little place to stay, little cabins, and you just made do and you did your job, and you don't die. So that's it's like that's different, and that was something that cowboys and such felt like was pretty much
par for the course,
normal, fine, nothing. It's just what has to be done. You take someone from New York that grew up there and you're like, we're going to drop you off in the wilderness for 2 or 3 weeks. They think they're going to die. There's like you said, a cultural difference. Yet it seems like every human being has this tie to hunting for food, that part of it is still considered respectable.
There's definitely something inside of us, some part of us, whether it's genetically or spiritually, that and I think people might disagree, but I think they'd be lying to themselves. There's something about hunting that we just get.
Well, that's a nice segue, Brent, right into
thank you.
This next part of the book, which I'm going to read.
What was going to happen?
It's called The Nature of the Beast. What beast do you think they're talking about?
Not me.
The human being. The nature of the beast. It all began, as they say, long ago, in the mid-18th century. Scottish economist Adam Smith put forward a historical perspective known as the 4 stages theory. Humanity, he said, had advanced initially through an age of hunting, followed by an age of herding, and then one of agriculture, before entering the age of commerce. Smith's theory was purely conjectural, but in 1925, Australian anatomist Raymond Dart informed the world that the fossil skull of a child with a combination of apish and human features found in a cave in Taung, South Africa, belonged to an extinct species of hominid that had walked upright with its hands free for the manipulation of tools and weapons. Dart, who named the species blah blah blah, noted that South Africa's open veldt country, where the Taung child had been found, was inhabited by dangerous beasts, and quite far from the forested areas that were usually the home of apes and chimpanzees. The challenges of survival in this semi-arid plain had led the Taung child, who had lived 2.5 million years ago, to develop bipedalism, a larger brain, and an active interest in new sources of food. The result, a struggle involving swiftness and stealth, a fierce and bitter mammalian competition, and laboratory essential to the penultimate phase of human evolution. Some big words there. Basically, because this ape-like hominid moved from the forested areas into the semi-arid plains of Africa, he needed to adapt. And that adaptation included different sources of food, being able to walk upright instead of on halfway, being able to run fast, go long distances, carry things and kill things. Dart's claims about the missing link between man and ape, which he described in the February 7th, 1925 issue of the British journal Nature, were not immediately accepted. But the idea that the Taung child had hunted and killed other animals would gain considerable credence and scientific consensus over time. Some of the baboon skulls he examined from the site had been bludgeoned, suggesting the animals were killed by a club, most likely, Dart speculated, the large leg bone of an antelope, and then butchered with other sharpened animal bones. Man's predecessors differed from living apes in being confirmed killers, Dart wrote in later series of papers. Early humans were carnivorous creatures. They seized living quarries by violence, battered them to death, tore apart their broken bodies, dismembered them limb from limb, slaking their ravenous thirst with the hot blood of victims and greedily devouring living, writhing flesh. That's some strong words there.
Yeah, I was looking forward to some lunch here in a minute, but I'm going to hold off.
They're basically saying, though, that the human being is these early hominid type species were very violent. But if you look at like bobos and chimpanzees, they're very violent.
They're very violent. Yeah.
They're quite violent.
They throw tantrums.
Yeah, and they kill and eat things.
Anything that throws feces is a violent creature.
And so he's talking about this missing link between, because you have, this is 1925, all right? So remember, we were just talking about 1901 was when Theodore Roosevelt became vice president and then later president of the United States at McKinley's assassination. So Theodore Roosevelt is talking about in the 1880s, Darwin's books, right? Charles Darwin's books on the descent of man.
So evolution's still a fairly newish
It's
idea.
a newish idea. Well, so, I think Theodore Roosevelt is president from 1901 to around 1909 or 10 or something like that. And then he goes on the River of Doubt expedition, and then he comes back, and then he dies like 5 years later or so. So this is about 10 years after Theodore Roosevelt's death, maybe give or take. And they find that missing link, and now they're like, whoa, this is like an in-betweener here. We have evidence of this sort of half ape, half man kind of thing that dates back to this rough period in time. And based on the evidence around the site where we found this, you can find all these animals that have been obviously killed and eaten. Okay. So this is new info coming up. Well, now we know a lot more about the human evolution and how we are today. But when he talks about how they seize creatures and beat them to death and tear them apart and eat them, it sounds kind of like what you see a grizzly bear do to elk calf.
Or a pack of wolves.
Or a pack of wolves.
If you want to not sleep good for a couple of days, go look at like how a pack of wolves
or a
eats
lion
something.
or a hyena. They will literally eat something while it's alive. It'll live for an hour or two while they're just taking off parts.
Just eating the back end.
Eating the back end. Like, you'll see these ants, and they're like, and they're like, you're like, can't you kill it first?
No.
They can't be bothered.
You see those lions eating those warthogs from the butt first, and they have no back end, but they're still like whipping their heads around trying to get away.
It's unreal. Unreal. And so he's talking about, okay, human beings are part of that process, or have been, is his case.
We came out of that, just like everything else.
So he writes, unpleasant stuff. That's a understatement. Unpleasant stuff.
Unpleasant.
Yet Dart's imaginative theories proved a starting point for an extensive conversation among anthropologists over what has become known as the hunting hypothesis, the belief that early man's long experience as a hunter, said to have occupied at least 99% of his prehistory, in contrast to his 1% as an agriculturalist, explains the physiological development as well as his social organization as a pack animal, basically. So what he's saying is the great majority of human evolution and existence, we're talking 99% honing the ability to be a hunter versus like 1% of it being agriculture, growing crops, and so forth. Like,
agriculture's so new.
it's like
so
10,000 years old.
Yeah, but how long have we been around?
Yeah, millions
Of years. Yeah, so you're talking about the last week of humans' existence. They've kind of figured out, oh, hey, we can plant crap.
Right. So this is all kind of new information, though. But it also undergirds the reason why human beings still crave the hunt, and why hunting is part of like our culture today still, even though technically you could just use cattle and sheep.
But every bit of our body, every bit of our brain, our eyes, our senses, they were developed to hunt.
Attuned to hunt, yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
Yep. And so he goes on to say, the pursuit of ever larger game would have necessitated not only greater individual physical and mental powers, but the ability to coordinate with others to manage the hunt itself, as well as the eventual sharing and preservation of meat. The adaptation to hunting in its total social, biological, technical, and physiological dimensions has dominated the course of human evolution for hundreds of thousands of years. Hunting not only developed civilization, but its uniformity, for the selection pressures of the hunting and gathering way of life were so similar, and the results so successful that populations of Homo sapiens are still fundamentally the same everywhere. He says, based on what we know now, on this account, on an account of this heritage, modern man is hardwired as a killer, found full articulation in the aftermath of the Second World War and the beginnings of the atomic age. Based on this hypothesis, right, there's some evidence to show that human beings are quite violent. And when you look at World War II and the Holocaust,
dude, go into the basement of any castle in Europe and you're going to find some scary things.
It shows that, human beings they have a tendency toward violence. They can. And this idea isn't a surprise, actually. And you know from within your own heart of hearts that when you want to, hurt someone else, there is that's in your DNA. There's an instinct there. Continuing on, the hunting hypothesis has subsequently been challenged by those unwilling to ascribe modern man's violent tendencies wholly to hunting genetics, while ignoring other possible explanations. Social inequality and desperation born of injustice, hunger, or displacement. Some researchers have also rejected as overly simplistic that part of the hunting hypothesis that suggests man hunted, developing superior athletic and spatial reasoning skills, while women cooked, gathered, and nurtured the young. If, as many believe, a large share of early man's diet was vegetable, then gathering, not hunting, was the primary activity and a major developmental aspect of our species, one in which women likely played a significant role. The same biological and intellectual changes attributed to hunting, such as bipedalism, cooperation, and the crafting of better tools, would have also been required for the success of primitive gathering societies. Indeed, agriculture, some argue, is a greater challenge and likely a stronger civilizing force than semi-nomadic hunting. It is the farmer, not the hunter, notes scholar Mary Zeiss Stange, who approaches the world of nature as something over which he must seize control. It's just an argument on, which was the primary driver behind human societies. Was it agriculture or not necessarily agriculture, but gathering versus hunting?
I think hunting had to have come first. I think that ability... I think society was caused by agriculture. Once agriculture came into place, we could have large-scale societies.
Yeah, because once you have enough food, you can stay in one place.
Yes,
and
but
things
we
change.
learned cooperation, which is one of the greatest assets humans have through hunting.
Yeah, I would agree that, first of all, if you just look at our ancestors, the chimpanzee, right? I don't know how many, I can't recall off the top of my head how many millions of years ago we supposedly shared the same, we were the same thing. And then the human diverged, okay? But if you look at that group of animals, they're sort of a gatherer hunter group, right? They're a hunter-gatherer with more gathering. So I think it started out with, less reliance on being a predator, but evolved because you can't have the brain capacity that human beings have today without the high degree of dense nutrition that comes from eating other animals and primarily animal fat.
Yeah,
so
our brains required a ton of fat.
Yeah, so to develop the brains that we have, it's pretty impossible to do while eating grass or by eating like vegetables the whole time. So that right there just demonstrates that hunting was a huge part of it. You just can't dismiss it. You just can't make it go away. It's just part of the storyline. Now, how much of the way we are today is attributable to hunting versus gathering? I just instinctively can say hunting is by far the larger contributor to the way we are.
The problem is there's a huge chunk out of the year where gathering is going to go kaput. It's a seasonal activity. You can still hunt when you can't gather.
Yeah. Well, you have some who try to, some scientists which are in the minority, that really try to say that human beings are more gatherers and that our societies were more around that and not so much of a hunter. Sometimes I think that those scientists have a bias where they want us to not be meat eaters, right? And that gets in the way of fact.
Our ancestors were pretty smart. I think they probably did both as much as they possibly could.
Right. Like an omnivore, like a bear, right? Like a bear.
Yeah.
Bear's going to get whatever it can get.
Yeah. It's going to eat grass. It's going to eat grains. It's going to eat bugs. It's going to eat that baby over there in the corner too. Like they're going to get its calories a calorie, and they're going to want as many as you could possibly get.
Right.
But you can't deny the way. I remember walking with my nephew one time, and he was maybe 4 or 5.
Yeah.
And I said, "There's a deer." I've never hunted with him. I've never talked to him about it or anything. And he squatted down, like into a squat, and put his arms around his legs. Because I had pointed, I said, "Deer."
Yeah.
And he instinctively got down, got small, and started looking for it.
Became a hunter.
Yeah, he's like 4 or 5.
Yeah.
I didn't tell him to do that.
He goes on in the book to say, even though there are those who sort of try to discount the amount of hunting that human beings have done or discount the role of hunting in human development, he says, despite all that, the sense that hunting is something we are meant for remains an article of faith. Hunters characterize what they do as deeply instinctual, a way of being in and with nature that offers a connection to a life force so profound it defies articulation, a feeling of renewal found nowhere else, the bliss that passes all understanding. For the liberal Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega, one of hunting's patron thinkers, man's longing to return to the hunt stems from the fact that it was as a hunter that he initially awakened to his potential mastery of the world. Every subsequent civilizing process has taken him away from that awakening, which the modern hunter re-enters, by temporarily rehabilitating that part of himself which is still an animal. This can be experienced only by placing himself in relation to another animal. If we want to enjoy that intense and pure happiness, we have to seek the company of the surly beast, descend to his level, feel emulation toward him, pursue him. This subtle right is the hunt.
Have you heard the theory of agriculture coming around via way of animal husbandry? That we first started doing animal husbandry and domesticating animals, and then started doing agriculture as a side effect to feed said animal husbandry animals.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It makes sense. I will say this, that human beings are very, very, we're all fascinated by animals. Mm-hmm. Any animal. You bring an animal into a nursery and there's every toy and gimmicky thing on the planet. There's video games. You bring food. A puppy in there and every kid will stop what they're doing and pay attention to the puppy.
Mm-hmm. Even if they can't touch it, they just want to look at it.
You bring a tree in, they're not going to do much.
This is a corn plant, kid.
Yeah, this is a corn plant. It's like, oh.
Just shove it up your ear.
You don't have the same, you just don't have the same, not to say that we don't appreciate trees and nature and so forth in plants. We do, but there's a difference. The degree to which we're drawn to animals on the whole. I'm sure that there's the human individuals who maybe are the opposite and are more interested in the husbandry than they are the...
But those people are still interested in the animals.
Yeah.
Do you know how many deer I've seen in my life? I still like watching them. Any chance I get.
Well, what do you think about what he said when he said hunters characterize what they do as deeply instinctual, a way of being in and with nature that offers a connection to a life force so profound it defies articulation?
When I hear that, I think that in nature, there is, for lack of a better word, the food chain. And we, as a society, I feel, try to remove ourselves from it as much as we possibly can. Like, how many people do you know eat meat but have never had to kill to eat their meat? And I think that we as hunters, when we say that we are in it and we are part of it, when you're a part of that, you almost have to be a part of the food chain to really be a part of it. If you're an animal and you're out in the woods, you are a part of this food chain.
Yeah.
And that...
There's definitely a disconnect for people who don't actually... that just buy their food pre-cooked, like you buy a taco and that's your life every day. It's different, man. You don't relate that to a living thing. When you go out and you shoot it and then you eat it over a campfire in the wilderness, there's an absolute connection there that's not present otherwise.
I would maybe break it down very simply to say that you are either a tourist or a native.
Or a participant.
Yeah. I mean, like, if you're a tourist and you're just there and you're watching, like if you go to Hawaii, I'm not some guy who's swigging juice or whatever and spitting out fire.
Yeah.
You know, I'm there watching the show.
Yeah. Well, he says, I like what he says here. Hunters characterize what they do as deeply instinctual, a renewal found nowhere else, a feeling of renewal found nowhere else. I think that I say that all the time, that when I go out into the wilderness and I spend a week or two out there, there is a feeling of renewal. There is this thing that's hard to articulate, where there is a connection to a life force, like he says, and he says that every subsequent civilizing process has taken man away from that awakening, which the modern hunter is able to re-enter when he goes into the wilderness and hunts.
I will say, once I've been out in the woods for 3 or 4 days, and I don't have electronics and the blue lights and the noise, I am a different creature.
Well, it's interesting how he says civilization basically is the opposite. You know, and he's right. Like, when you enter civilization, you don't have to deal with being cold. You know, you have a heated home. You have cars that drive you. You don't have to walk. You don't have to kill your own food. You don't have to cook it even. You can just buy it. Like, everything about civilization is the opposite
I think the antithesis of what you're saying, Brian, is the chicken nugget. I mean, there's nothing more removed from nature than the ability to go spend $1 and get chicken nuggets.
Yeah. Well, he says that you accomplish this by temporarily rehabilitating that part of yourself, which is still an animal.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I agree with that necessarily. I understand it. I don't like how it's phrased. That the only way to turn your senses on, like all the way, is either in battle or in the hunt. Those are like the two things that I feel like just intensely, like all your senses are firing. Everything is, alert. Mm-hmm. There's this sense of being alive and the way the wind blows, the way the sense in the air, the sounds that you hear, like every speck of it matters, and you're keenly paying attention to all of that. That right there, you just don't achieve that when you go on a nature walk. There's something a little different when you have a bow and arrow in your hand and you're pursuing a black bear or an elk versus, walking with a camera to photograph a bird.
It's not the same.
It certainly isn't the same when it comes down to that moment of truth where you're going to kill something. Mm-hmm. There's a moral conundrum that you're faced with where you love the animal, you appreciate the animal, you love seeing the animal, you like knowing the animal is alive and that you're pursuing it. But at the same time, you're like, I'm also going to take its life. Is that morally justified? And you're presented with that, and at every time you do it. And then when you do it, there's a process of somewhat of for me, there's a little bit of a feeling of loss. There's a loss and there's an excitement that happen at the same time. Mm-hmm. And depending on my closeness or relationship with that animal, I know it sounds weird, mm-hmm. that loss can feel more profound or less profound. Like mm-hmm. a deer that I have tracked for 4 years and finally killed, I feel a bigger loss mm-hmm. than to one I just randomly came across and I shot. Nevertheless, it's always present, but it disappears the moment I start butchering it, cutting it up, taking the heart and the liver and mm-hmm. the quarters, and I start putting them into different bags.
Once the process begins and it's no longer the creature and it's becoming parts and meat, dinners, meals to share.
It's like a catharsis. It heals that loss. It makes that loss sort of have a meaning and a purpose behind it. And then it's a different feeling. You walk away from that feeling fulfilled in a way mm-hmm. and grateful, profoundly grateful, I think, if you're doing it the right way with the right motives and the right attitude. Support us by going out there and subscribing to the newsletter. Support us by using the code GRITTY at Mountain Ops to save. If you got some orders and products you want to get Mountain Ops, get yourself some trekking poles. We got these sissy sticks, which I can't say enough about these. I think you're going to spend over $200 for an equivalent pair at REI that are both carbon and aluminum. Ryan Lampers and I put these to the test. These things are incredible, and they're going to cost you, with our discount, like $100.
I think it's $115.
$115 or something. So that helps us out, and so do that, and also use the code GRITTY at Seek Outside. Save 5% on shelters and on all the lightweight stoves, titanium stoves for your later season hunts. Even September, I like using them in September. And use the code GRITTY for your backcountry meals with Heather's Choice. You save 15% off there. And for you archers out there, use the code GRITTY for Valkyrie broadheads. Get yourself some Jagger or Blood Eagle broadheads. I think that's kind of it for now. Stay gritty.